The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty boarding house, and Hannah Norwood pressed her trembling hands against her hollow stomach, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her life coming to Sloan, Nevada in the scorching summer of 1882. Through the window, she could see a tall man standing beside a horse, his hat pulled low against the relentless sun, and she knew without being told that this was Henry Ingram, the rancher who had answered her advertisement and sent money for her passage west. Her late mother's voice echoed in her mind, the sharp reprimands about eating too much, taking more than her share, being nothing but a burden who consumed resources better spent elsewhere. Hannah had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, to survive on scraps and apologies. The driver opened the door, and the heat hit her like a physical force as she stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk, clutching her worn carpetbag. Henry Ingram moved toward her with an easy stride, and Hannah instinctively took a step back, her eyes lowering to the dusty boards beneath her feet. He was broader than she had imagined, his shoulders filling out his chambray shirt, his hands large and work-roughened as he reached to take her bag. She flinched before she could stop herself, and she saw him freeze, his hands suspended in the air between them. "Miss Norwood," he said, his voice deeper than she had expected, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size. "I am Henry Ingram. I hope your journey was not too difficult." Hannah forced herself to meet his eyes, finding them an unexpected shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the distant mountains. "It was fine, thank you, Mr. Ingram." Her voice came out barely above a whisper, and she hated herself for the weakness it revealed. He gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby, and she followed at a respectful distance, climbing up onto the seat when he offered his hand to help her. His palm was warm and calloused, but his grip remained gentle, and he released her the moment she was settled. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour, during which he pointed out landmarks and spoke of the land, his words filling the silence she could not seem to break. Hannah watched the sage-covered landscape roll past, the mountains rising in the distance, and tried to imagine herself belonging here, tried to picture herself as the wife of this quiet-spoken man beside her. The ranch house appeared on the horizon, a sturdy structure of wood and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Hannah could see corrals and outbuildings, horses grazing in a distant pasture, and chickens scratching in the yard. It was more than she had dared hope for, more than she deserved, and the old familiar guilt rose up to choke her. What right did she have to claim any of this? What had she ever done to earn such bounty? "I know it is not much," Henry said, misreading her silence. "But it is solid and the roof does not leak. The well is deep and the water runs clean year-round." "It is beautiful," Hannah managed, and she meant it. Compared to the cramped tenement rooms in Boston where she had lived with her mother, and then alone after the fever took her, this ranch was a palace, an impossible dream made real. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag to the porch. "I thought you might want to rest before supper." "The bedroom is upstairs, first door on the right. I have been sleeping in the small room down the hall, and I will continue to do so until you are comfortable with other arrangements." His face colored slightly as he said this, and Hannah felt her own cheeks burn. They were to be married in 3 days, by the circuit preacher who came through Sloan monthly. But Henry was offering her time, offering her a choice in how their union would unfold. Inside, the house was clean and simply furnished, with whitewashed walls and sturdy wooden furniture that looked handmade. Hannah climbed the stairs to find a bedroom with a real bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain pitcher and bowl, and a window that looked out over the ranch land stretching toward the mountains. She sat on the edge of the bed, her bag still clutched in her hands, and tried to convince herself that this was real, that she was allowed to be here. When she came downstairs an hour later, drawn by the smell of cooking food and her own desperate hunger, she found Henry in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot on the cast-iron stove. He looked up when she entered, and a smile crossed his face, transforming his serious features into something warm and welcoming. "I hope you like stew," he said. "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage the basics. Tomorrow I thought we might ride into town, let you pick up anything you need, maybe some fabric if you want to make curtains or such. The general store has a good selection." Hannah nodded, her eyes fixed on the pot, on the chunks of meat and vegetables she could see bubbling in the rich broth. Her stomach cramped with want, but years of training kept her rooted in place near the doorway. She should offer to help, she thought, but before she could speak, Henry was ladling stew into 2 bowls, generous portions that made her throat tight with anxiety. He carried both bowls to the table, setting one at the head and one to the right. Then he pulled out the chair where he had placed the fuller bowl and gestured for her to sit. Hannah stared at him, confusion and old fear warring in her chest. "That is too much," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I cannot eat all that, I should not." Henry's brow furrowed and he studied her for a long moment. "Are you feeling ill? I have some ginger tea if your stomach is unsettled from the journey." "No, I just—" She struggled to find the words, to explain a lifetime of lessons about knowing her place, about taking only what was left, about the sin of greediness. "I do not need so much. You should eat first. You have been working all day." Something shifted in his expression, a flash of understanding followed by something that might have been anger, though not directed at her. He pulled out the chair more firmly. "Hannah, please sit down." She obeyed, her hands knotted together in her lap as he took his own seat at the head of the table. But instead of picking up his spoon, he reached across and gently pushed her bowl closer to her. "This is your home now," he said quietly. "And in this house, you will never go hungry and you will never eat last or least. Do you understand me?" Hannah felt tears prick her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. She did not deserve his kindness, did not know how to accept it without feeling like a thief stealing what belonged to others. But Henry waited, patient and immovable, until she finally picked up her spoon with shaking hands. The stew was simple but delicious, and she forced herself to eat slowly, to take small bites even though her body screamed for her to consume everything as quickly as possible before someone took it away. Henry ate his own meal, talking between bites about the ranch, about the horses he was breeding, about his plans to expand the herd next spring. His words were casual, but Hannah sensed he was trying to put her at ease, trying to make the meal feel normal and unhurried. She managed half the bowl before her stomach, unaccustomed to so much food, began to protest. She set down her spoon apologetically. "I am sorry, I cannot finish it. I did not mean to waste." "You did not waste anything," Henry assured her. "There is always tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. You will eat when you are hungry, as much or as little as you want. That is how it works here." That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Hannah stared at the ceiling and tried to understand this man who had brought her across a continent to be his wife. He was nothing like what she had expected, nothing like the men she had known in Boston who saw women as property or burden. Henry Ingram treated her like something precious, like someone worthy of care, and she did not know how to reconcile that with everything she had been taught about her own worthlessness. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. When she came downstairs, still wearing the same dress from yesterday, Henry was at the stove again. He looked up with that same welcoming smile. "Good morning. I hope I did not wake you too early." The ranch tends to start the day with the sun." He gestured to the table, where he had already set out 2 plates. As she watched, he loaded both with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of toasted bread. And just like the night before, he carried the fuller plate to her spot and pulled out her chair. "Mr. Ingram," she started, but he held up a hand. "Henry, please. We are to be married in 2 days. I think we can dispense with formalities." He settled into his own chair, but again, he did not touch his food until she picked up her fork. Hannah ate more this morning, her stomach gradually adjusting to regular meals. Henry talked about their ride into town, about people she would meet, about the wedding that would take place at the small church on the edge of Sloan. He mentioned that his ranch hand, a weathered man named Pete who lived in the bunkhouse, would be one of the witnesses, along with the general store owner's wife, a kind woman named Margaret. The ride into Sloan revealed a small but thriving town, with a main street lined with businesses and houses spreading out behind them. Henry helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store, and Hannah felt the weight of curious eyes as they entered. A plump woman with graying hair looked up from behind the counter and broke into a wide smile. "Henry Ingram, you did not tell me your bride was arriving so soon." She came around the counter and took Hannah's hands warmly. "I am Margaret Thornton, dear, and I am so pleased to meet you." Henry has been talking about nothing else for weeks. Hannah glanced at Henry, who had the grace to look embarrassed. Margaret laughed and patted his arm. "Do not worry, I did not give away all your secrets. Now, Miss Norwood, let us see about getting you some necessities. Henry, you can make yourself useful and carry packages." For the next hour, Margaret guided Hannah through the store, suggesting items with a practiced eye. Fabric for dresses, thread and needles, a new pair of shoes to replace Hannah's worn ones, ribbons and lace, and a beautiful length of cream-colored silk that Margaret insisted would make a perfect wedding dress. Hannah protested the expense, but Henry simply nodded to Margaret to add it to the growing pile, along with a new hat, gloves, and a warm shawl for the winter months ahead. "You will need a good coat too," Margaret said. "Winters here can be bitter, even if the summers are hot enough to fry an egg on a rock." When they finally tallied everything, Hannah felt dizzy at the amount. She had never owned so much, never imagined she would be worth such an investment. But Henry paid without hesitation, and Margaret promised to have the wedding dress ready in time for the ceremony. As they loaded the packages into the wagon, a rough-looking man on horseback rode past, his eyes lingering on Hannah with an expression that made her skin crawl. Henry stepped between them, his posture subtly protective, and the man rode on with a low laugh. "That was Vic Harding," Henry said quietly as he helped Hannah into the wagon. "He owns the saloon and has fingers in some less reputable businesses. Best to stay clear of him." Hannah nodded, filing the information away. She had dealt with men like that in Boston, men who saw women alone as easy targets. But she was not alone anymore, she realized. She had Henry, and whatever else she did not understand about their arrangement, she believed he would protect her. The wedding took place on a bright Thursday morning, with the preacher performing the ceremony in the small church while Margaret, Pete, and a handful of curious townspeople looked on. Hannah wore the cream silk dress that Margaret and 2 other women had worked through the night to finish, and Henry wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. He spoke his vows in a steady voice, his eyes never leaving hers, and when he slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Hannah felt something shift inside her, a tiny seed of hope taking root. The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief and chaste, but Henry's hand trembled slightly as it cupped her cheek, and Hannah saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. He cared for her, she realized. Somehow, impossibly, this man who had known her only through letters and 3 days in person cared what happened to her. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and that evening, Henry prepared a special supper of roasted chicken with vegetables from the garden he kept behind the house. As he had done every meal since her arrival, he filled her plate first, setting it before her with the same quiet insistence that she eat her fill. "Why do you do that?" Hannah asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could think better of it. "Why do you always serve me first?" Henry sat down with his own plate, considering his answer. "My father was a hard man," he said finally. "He believed that men came first in all things, that women and children should take what was left and be grateful for it. I watched my mother grow thin and tired, always making sure he had the best of everything while she scraped by on scraps. When she died, I was 15, and I swore that if I ever had a wife, I would treat her differently. I would make sure she knew she mattered, that her needs were as important as mine." He looked at Hannah directly, and she saw old pain in his eyes. "I do not know what your life was like before you came here, but I have seen the way you look at food, the way you hesitate, like you are waiting for permission or punishment. I want you to know that you have a place at this table, Hannah. You have a right to be fed and cared for. You are my wife now, and that means something to me." Hannah felt tears spill down her cheeks, unable to hold them back any longer. "My mother used to say I was too expensive to keep," she whispered, "that every bite I took was a bite stolen from someone more deserving. After she died, I tried to make myself smaller to need less, to take up less space in the world. I thought if I could just be less of a burden, maybe someone would want me." Henry reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "You are not a burden. You are my wife, and I want you here, eating at my table, living in my house, building a life with me. Do you think you can believe that, even if it takes time?" Hannah nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "I will try." The weeks that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Henry woke early to tend the horses and cattle, while Hannah learned to manage the house and cook proper meals. Margaret visited often, teaching her to bake bread and preserve vegetables, and slowly, a friendship grew between them. Pete, the ranch hand, was a quiet man who tipped his hat respectfully and praised her cooking with genuine appreciation. And every evening, Henry came in from his work, washed up and prepared supper with her, always making sure her plate was filled first, always waiting until she took her first bite before he began his own meal. Hannah felt herself changing, growing stronger as her body adjusted to regular meals and her spirit adjusted to kindness. She began to smile more easily, to speak without constantly monitoring her words for potential offense. She learned to ride, sitting astride one of Henry's gentler horses and galloping across the open range with the wind in her hair. She planted flowers around the porch and made curtains for the windows, slowly claiming the house as her own. But the greatest change came in her relationship with Henry. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but something deeper was growing between them. She noticed the way his eyes followed her when she moved around the kitchen, the way he found excuses to touch her hand or shoulder, the gentle consideration he showed in all things. And she noticed her own response, the way her heart beat faster when he came through the door, the way she found herself watching him work, admiring the strength in his arms and the kindness in his face. 3 months after their wedding, on a cool October evening, Henry built a fire in the stone fireplace, and they sat together on the settee, closer than they had sat before. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Hannah leaned into his warmth, feeling safe in a way she had never experienced. "Are you happy here?" Henry asked, his arm coming around her shoulders. Hannah turned to look up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his question. "I am happier than I ever thought possible. You have given me so much, Henry. A home, a life, a reason to believe I am worth something." "You were always worth something," he said fiercely. "You just needed someone to show you." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of his evening beard, the warmth of his skin. "I think I am falling in love with you," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. His eyes darkened, and his hand came up to cover hers. "I loved you before you ever arrived," he said. "I loved the woman who wrote those letters, who was brave enough to travel across the country to start a new life. And I have fallen deeper in love with the woman you are, the woman you are becoming." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the brief touch at their wedding. This kiss was deep and searching, full of months of restrained longing and growing affection. Hannah melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and desire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Will you share my room tonight?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Will you truly be my wife?" "Yes," Hannah breathed and let him lead her upstairs. Their union was tender and careful, with Henry treating her like precious glass, constantly checking that she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. Hannah had expected something harsh and perfunctory based on whispered conversations she had overheard among women in Boston, but this was different. This was connection and intimacy, vulnerability and trust. Afterward, lying in Henry's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Hannah felt tears of gratitude rather than pain. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" His hand stroked through her hair, the gesture soothing. "For being patient with me. For showing me what love is supposed to be." "Thank you for giving me a chance," he replied. "For trusting me with your heart." Winter came to Nevada with surprising force, bringing cold winds and occasional snow that dusted the mountains and turned the high desert white. Hannah discovered she loved the cold season, loved the excuse to stay inside by the fire, to bake bread and stews that filled the house with warmth and delicious smells. Henry taught her to play chess on long evenings, and they read aloud to each other from books ordered from a catalog, their voices filling the quiet house. But the peace was shattered one frozen January morning when Vic Harding rode up to the ranch with 3 other men, all armed and looking for trouble. Henry went out to meet them, gesturing for Hannah to stay inside, but she watched anxiously from the window. "What can I do for you, Harding?" Henry's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "I am looking to expand my holdings," Harding said, his voice oily with false friendliness. "This is good land, Ingram. I will give you a fair price. It is not for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price, or under the right circumstances." The threat was barely veiled. Henry's stance shifted, becoming more alert, and Hannah saw Pete emerge from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand. "I think you and your men should leave now." Harding's smile turned cruel. "I always get what I want, Ingram, one way or another. You think about that." He wheeled his horse around and the others followed, but the menace in his parting words hung in the air. That evening, Henry was quiet and tense through supper, though he still served Hannah first, still waited for her to begin eating. But his mind was clearly elsewhere, working through problems and solutions. "What are we going to do?" Hannah asked finally, setting down her fork. "We." Henry looked at her, something like surprise crossing his face. "This is my home too," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." He reached across and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Harding has been buying up land in this area for the past year. Rumors say he wants to control all the water rights, charge ranchers fees to access the river. If he gets his way, he will own everyone in the territory." "But he cannot just take your land, can he? You have legal title. Legal does not always mean much out here when you are dealing with men like Harding. He has the sheriff in his pocket and enough guns to make things difficult. Henry sighed. But I will not give up without a fight. This land is our future, yours and mine. I will not let him steal that from us. Over the next weeks, tension ratcheted higher. Fences were cut, allowing cattle to wander. The barn door was found smashed open one morning, though thankfully the horses had not fled. Pete reported seeing strange riders on the property at odd hours, always disappearing before he could confront them. Hannah felt her old fears resurface, the terror of losing everything, of being cast adrift again with nowhere to go. But she fought against the panic, forcing herself to stand tall beside Henry, to help where she could. She learned to shoot, practicing with an old rifle until she could hit a target at 50 yards. She helped Pete repair fences and reinforce the locks on all the outbuildings. And every evening, she and Henry sat together at the table, and he filled her plate first, a ritual that had become their anchor, their reminder of what they were fighting for. The confrontation came in late February when Harding and 6 men rode onto the ranch at dawn, torches in hand. Henry and Pete met them in the yard, both armed, while Hannah watched from the porch, rifle loaded and ready. "This is your last chance, Ingram," Harding called out. "Sell to me, or I will burn you out and take it anyway." "You will not touch my land or my home," Henry said, his voice steady despite the odds. "And if you try, there will be consequences," Harding laughed. "What consequences? Who is going to stop me? You, your hired hand, your little mail-order bride." "Me," said a new voice, and everyone turned to see Margaret's husband, Thomas Thornton, riding up with a dozen men from town. "And us." More riders appeared, ranchers and townspeople who had heard about Harding's threats and decided they had had enough. The territorial marshal was among them, his badge glinting in the early morning light. "Vic Harding, you are under arrest for extortion, assault, and attempted arson," the marshal said calmly. "Your reign of terror in this territory is over." Harding's face twisted with rage, and his hand dropped to his gun, but before he could draw, Pete's rifle cracked and the pistol flew from Harding's hand. The other gunmen, suddenly surrounded and outnumbered, raised their hands in surrender. As the marshal led Harding and his men away, Thomas Thornton rode up to the porch and tipped his hat to Henry and Hannah. "Nobody pushes around good people in this territory," he said simply. "We take care of our own." The relief was overwhelming, and Hannah felt her knees go weak. Henry caught her, pulling her into his arms, and she clung to him, tears of release streaming down her face. They had survived, they had kept their home, and they had done it together. Spring came to the ranch with a burst of wildflowers and new life. The horses produced several foals, and the cattle thrived on the rich grass that grew after winter rains. Henry and Hannah worked side by side, their partnership in labor matching their partnership in life. And in May, Hannah realized her monthly courses had not come, and other telltale signs suggested the reason why. She told Henry one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. His expression cycled through surprise, joy, and then fierce protectiveness in the space of seconds. "A baby," he said wonderingly, his hand reaching out to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy," Henry laughed, a sound of pure delight. "Hannah, I am overwhelmed with happiness. You have given me everything I ever wanted." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Margaret visited often, bringing advice and baby clothes she had saved from her own children's infancy. Henry became almost comically protective, insisting Hannah rest constantly, forbidding her from lifting anything heavy, and cooking all the meals himself. And always, He filled her plate first, making sure she and the baby growing inside her had everything they needed. On a cold December morning, with Margaret and the doctor in attendance, Hannah gave birth to a son. He came into the world with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair, and when the doctor placed him in Hannah's arms, she felt a love so fierce and complete that it took her breath away. Henry sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, staring down at their son with wonder in his eyes. "He is perfect," he whispered. "What should we name him?" "What was your mother's maiden name?" Hannah asked. "Carter, Sarah Carter, before she married my father." "Then let us name him Carter Ingram." She looked up at Henry. "To honor the woman who made you the man you are, who taught you compassion through her suffering." Henry's eyes filled with tears and he kissed her forehead gently. "That is a perfect name, thank you." Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting, and more wonderful than Hannah had imagined possible. She nursed Carter by the fire while snow fell outside, sang him lullabies her own mother had sung before bitterness consumed her, and marveled at how something so small could contain so much life and potential. Henry was a devoted father, walking the floor at night when Carter fussed, changing nappies without complaint, and staring at his son with an expression of absolute adoration. And every evening when they sat down to supper, Henry still filled Hannah's plate first, a ritual that had grown from simple courtesy into a daily declaration of love and respect. Carter would eventually sit in a high chair between them, learning by example that in their family, everyone was valued, everyone was fed, everyone mattered. The years rolled forward with the steady progression of seasons. Carter grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and following his father around the ranch. 2 years after his birth, Hannah delivered twin daughters, Grace and Clara, who had their father's gray-blue eyes and their mother's dark hair. The ranch prospered under Henry's careful management, and they added more land, more cattle, and eventually built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Through it all, through busy days and sleepless nights, through challenges and triumphs, Henry never wavered in his devotion to Hannah. And Hannah, who had once believed herself worthless and burdensome, learned to accept love as her birthright, learned to take up space in the world without apology, learned that she was worthy of every good thing that came her way. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching Carter teach his sisters to ride in the corral while Pete called out instructions. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Hannah leaned into Henry's embrace, feeling utterly content. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Answering my advertisement, bringing me here sight unseen?" Henry turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Not for a single moment. You are the best decision I ever made, Hannah Ingram. You and our children are my whole world. You saved my life," she said simply. "In every way that matters." "We saved each other," he corrected. "I was lonely and purposeless before you came. You gave me a reason to be better, to build something lasting." He smiled, that warm expression that still made her heart skip. "And speaking of building, I am starving. Should we call the children in for supper?" Hannah laughed, the sound bright and free. "Yes, let us eat, but you know the rule." "Your plate comes first," Henry said, as he had said thousands of times before. "Always yours first." They gathered their family and went inside, where the table was set for 5, and the kitchen smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread. Henry filled Hannah's plate and set it before her with the same care he had shown on her first night at the ranch. That small gesture that had meant everything to a frightened, starving girl who did not believe she deserved kindness. As they bowed their heads for grace, Hannah looked around at her husband, her children, her home, and felt gratitude wash over her in waves. She had traveled across a continent chasing hope, and she had found it in the hands of a cowboy who understood that love was not just words or passion, but daily actions that proved worth and commitment. The Wild West was a harsh and unforgiving place, but within the walls of their ranch house, Hannah had found sanctuary, safety, and a love that sustained her through all of life's storms. She had been a mail-order bride, afraid to eat at his table, certain she did not deserve a place there. But Henry had set her plate first every meal, had insisted on her value until she finally believed it herself. And in believing, she had become whole. The desert wind whispered across the ranch as darkness fell, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant call of coyotes. Inside, the Ingram family laughed and talked over their supper, their voices blending into a symphony of ordinary happiness that was, in its own way, quite extraordinary. Carter described a horse he wanted to train. The twins giggled over some shared secret, and Henry and Hannah exchanged glances full of private understanding and enduring affection. When the meal ended and the children were tucked into bed, Henry and Hannah stood together in the kitchen, washing dishes in companionable silence. Through the window, stars blazed in the Nevada sky, countless points of light in the vast darkness, each one holding its position in the cosmic dance. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, drying a plate and setting it carefully in the cupboard. Hannah considered, her hands moving automatically through the warm, soapy water. "I am thinking about how strange life is. A few years ago, I was alone in Boston, convinced I would die there in poverty and obscurity. I could not have imagined this, any of this. The very idea that someone like you existed seemed like a fantasy. Someone like me." Henry moved closer, his presence warm at her back. "Someone good," Hannah said softly. "Someone who keeps his promises and treats people with kindness. Someone who sees worth in others that they cannot see in themselves." She turned to face him, her wet hands reaching for his. "You taught me to value myself, Henry. That is a gift beyond price." He pulled her close, heedless of the dishwater soaking into his shirt. "You taught me that love is not about control or dominance, but about building something together, about being partners in all things. Before you, I thought I needed a wife to cook and clean and give me children. I did not understand that I needed a partner, a companion, someone to share not just my bed but my life." They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become their best selves. Outside, the Nevada night deepened, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its hunting song. The ranch settled into sleep, the horses quiet in their stalls, the cattle bedded down in the pastures, everything peaceful and secure. Time continued its relentless march, bringing with it more changes and more blessings. Carter grew tall and capable, taking over more of the ranch work, and showing a natural gift for training horses. At 18, he married a rancher's daughter from the next valley, a spirited young woman named Emma who fit seamlessly into the Ingram family. Grace became a teacher, opening a school in Sloan and educating the children of ranchers and miners alike. Clara, the quieter twin, discovered a talent for healing and studied with the town doctor, eventually becoming a nurse who traveled throughout the territory helping those in need. Henry and Hannah watched their children flourish with pride and satisfaction, knowing they had broken the cycles of their own painful childhoods and created something better. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region, known not just for quality livestock but for the fairness with which Henry conducted business and treated his workers. On their 25th anniversary, The entire family gathered for a celebration that lasted 3 days. Grandchildren ran through the house that Hannah had made a home, their laughter echoing off walls that had witnessed years of love and struggle and triumph. Friends from town came bearing gifts and good wishes, and even the territorial governor sent a letter commending Henry for his contributions to Nevada's development. But the moment Hannah treasured most came on the actual anniversary evening, when everyone else had gone to bed and she and Henry sat alone in the kitchen where their journey together had truly begun. Henry prepared a simple meal, just the two of them, and as he had done for 25 years, he filled her plate first and set it before her. "Some things never change," Hannah said, smiling. "The important things should not change," Henry replied. "You are still the first person I think of when I wake and the last before I sleep. You are still the center of my world, Hannah. 25 years has not diminished that in the slightest." "I love you," she said, the words still carrying the weight of wonder even after all this time. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," he answered. My brave mail-order bride who was not too proud to admit she was afraid, and not too afraid to accept love when it was offered. They ate their anniversary supper in the quiet house, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a quarter-century together. Through the window, they could see the moon rising over the mountains, its silver light painting the desert landscape in shades of pewter and shadow. Somewhere out there, other people were struggling with the same fears and doubts that had once consumed Hannah, wondering if they mattered, if they deserved love, if life could ever be more than mere survival. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Sloan, Nevada, it would illuminate a ranch where love had taken root and flourished, where a simple act of kindness, repeated daily, had transformed two damaged souls into whole and integrated beings. The story of Henry and Hannah Ingram would become part of local legend, told and retold as an example of what was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty, partnership over domination, and love over fear. But on that anniversary night, they were simply two people who had found each other across distance and circumstance, who had built a life together, one meal, one day, one choice at a time. Hannah looked at her husband, seeing the gray threading through his dark hair, the lines that years of sun and work had etched into his face, and she thought he had never been more handsome. "What happens next?" she asked, gesturing to encompass not just the kitchen but their entire life. Henry smiled, that same warm expression that had greeted her when she stepped off the stagecoach all those years ago. "We keep going. We love our children and spoil our grandchildren. We watch the sun rise and set over our land. We sit at this table and I fill your plate first, because that is who we are and how we show love." He reached across and took her hand. "We grow old together, Hannah, and we count every day as the blessing it is." "That sounds perfect," she said, squeezing his fingers, and it was. The years that followed were gentler, as age brought its inevitable changes. Henry's hair went fully silver, and his hands developed the slight tremor of advancing years. Hannah's dark hair turned white as snow, and her step grew slower, though her mind remained sharp and clear. They continued to work the ranch, though Carter took over the heavy labor, and they spent more time simply being together, enjoying the peace they had earned. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the desert transform from gold to purple to deepest blue as the sun set. They played with grandchildren who came to visit, telling stories of the old days when the West was still wild and untamed. They traveled to visit Grace and Sloan and Clara at the hospital where she worked in Carson City, proud of the strong, independent women their daughters had become. And every evening, without fail, they sat down to supper together, and Henry filled Hannah's plate first. It had become more than a ritual. It was a sacrament, a daily renewal of vows that went deeper than words. In that simple act, Hannah saw her whole life reflected. The fear she had overcome, the love she had learned to accept, the woman she had become through Henry's patient devotion. On a soft spring evening, when Hannah was 72 and Henry 74, they sat together on the porch swing they had installed years before. The ranch spread before them in twilight beauty, and they could hear Carter and Emma's children playing in the yard, their young voices full of joy and energy. "We did well," Hannah said, leaning her head on Henry's shoulder. "We did very well indeed," he agreed, his arm coming around her in the embrace that still felt like coming home. "I never thanked you properly, you know." Hannah's voice was thoughtful. "For saving me, for seeing something in me worth saving." "You saved yourself," Henry corrected gently. "You were brave enough to take a chance, to leave everything you knew and trust a stranger. I just gave you a safe place to land. Everything else you did on your own." Hannah considered this, turning it over in her mind. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps her survival and eventual thriving had required both his kindness and her courage, working together like two hands clasping, each supporting the other. It had never been one or the other, but always both, always together. "Then I thank you for being my partner," she said. "For walking beside me instead of ahead or behind. For treating me as an equal when the world said I was less. For filling my plate first when everything in me said I should wait and take what was left." Henry kissed the top of her head, a gesture he had performed 10,000 times and which never failed to make her feel cherished. "Thank you for saying yes to a lonely cowboy's proposal. Thank you for making this house a home and my life a joy. Thank you for our children, and for every single day we have had together." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first awkward conversations and would witness countless more evenings of companionship. The desert night sang its eternal song of wind and distance and vast open spaces, and within that immensity, Henry and Hannah Ingram held onto each other, two small lights burning steady against the darkness. The end, when it came years later, came gently. Henry passed first, in his sleep on a cold December night, with Hannah holding his hand and his children gathered around the bed. He went peacefully, with a slight smile on his face, and Hannah knew he had died as he had lived, content in the knowledge that he was loved and had loved well in return. Hannah followed him 18 months later, in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming across the ranch land. She spent her final days in the house they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had all benefited from the love she and Henry had modeled. And on her last morning, Carter brought her breakfast in bed and set the tray before her carefully, making sure everything was arranged just so. "Your plate first, Mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like Papa always did." Hannah smiled, her eyes misty with tears and memory. "He was a good man, your father, the best man I ever knew." "He learned from the best woman," Carter replied, kissing her forehead. Hannah took a few bites, more to please her son than from any real hunger, and then she lay back against the pillows, feeling the pull of whatever came next. She was not afraid. How could she be afraid when she was going to wherever Henry waited? Death was just another journey, like the one she had taken so many years ago from Boston to Nevada, another leap of faith into the unknown. As her eyes closed for the last time, Hannah's final thoughts were not of regret or sorrow, but of gratitude. She had been given so much more than she had ever dared hope for: love, family, home, purpose, and the knowledge that she mattered. She had been a frightened mail-order bride who did not believe she deserved to eat at a table, and she had become a woman who knew her worth and claimed her place without apology. And through it all, from that first evening to this final morning, someone had made sure her plate came first, had proved through daily action that she was valued and valuable, deserving of care and consideration. That gift had transformed her life, and through her transformation, had rippled outward to touch everyone she encountered. The Ingram ranch continued for generations, each new family building on the foundation Henry and Hannah had established. The story of the cowboy who set his bride's plate first became family legend, told to children as an example of what love looked like in practice, not just theory. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered across the sage, people claimed they could feel the presence of Henry and Hannah still, walking hand in hand across the land they had loved, eternally together, eternally home. In the end, theirs was a simple story about simple things: kindness overcoming fear, patience transforming pain, and love building something lasting from the broken pieces of two wounded hearts. It was a story about choosing to be better, to break cycles of hurt and create new patterns of healing. It was a story about setting someone's plate first, every single meal, until they finally believed they deserved to be fed. And it was a love story, the truest kind, where two people found in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. And in becoming whole, created something beautiful that endured long after they were gone. The Wild West was full of tales of gunfights and gold strikes, of outlaws and adventures, but the story of Henry and Hannah Ingram proved that the most powerful force in that harsh landscape was not violence or greed, but the quiet, steady strength of love given freely and received gratefully. That love lived on in their descendants, in the ranch that still operated according to principles of fairness and respect, in the town of Sloan where their contributions were remembered and honored. It lived on in the example they had set, proving that broken people could heal, that mail-order marriages could become great love stories, and that sometimes the simplest gestures carried the deepest meaning. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond this one, Henry and Hannah Ingram sat at a table together, and he filled her plate first, and they smiled at each other with the knowledge of a love that had transcended time and circumstance to become something eternal and unbreakable. They had found each other against all odds, had built a life worth living, and had loved well until the very end. That was their legacy, and it was enough.